Do you remember just last week when this shelf up here was still packed full with Pentax lenses? Looks a little bit empty now, right? And actually, there's my Canon M50 kit lens, and this is not even a real lens. It's one of those mugs to drink from. I just put it up there so it looks less empty. Now you know. Now, I did receive this in the mail today, the Canon 35mm RF for my Canon R5, but as long as I don't have my Canon R5, this is useless. So, it's just the kit lens up there. That's what we're gonna talk about today, because kit lenses aren't bad, they're just misunderstood. You have to know and understand the limitations. I'll give you some tips for photography and video to get the most out of your kit lens. Oh, and the 35mm RF is right here. I didn't throw it, oh, you know, okay. So the problem with kit lenses is that they have limitations, and the first one is sharpness. But I don't really mind that a cheap kit lens is a little bit less sharp than an expensive one. That's normal. Also, in most cases, a little bit of sharpness in Photoshop will improve the results. So unless it's really bad, don't worry too much about sharpness. The real limitation with a kit lens for me usually is aperture, because I really like a blurry background, or at least I want to be able to choose if I want a blurry background or not. And to get a blurry background, you need a wide aperture, so f2.8, f2, even f1.4. The lower the number, the shallower the depth of field will be. Now, the problem with a lot of kit lenses is that zoomed out, you can shoot at f3.5 with this one, for example. But when I zoom in all the way, it gets limited to f6.3. That seems pretty high, right? To get a blurry background? Well, it's actually not that bad. Let me explain. It's not only the aperture that influences the blurry background, it's also focal length and distance to the subject, even sensor size, but that's not what we're gonna talk about today. A longer focal length, let's say 85mm at f3.5, will have a much shallower depth of field than a 24mm at f3.5. And then second, the closer you get to your subject, the shallower the depth of field becomes. Those two things are really important if you want to improve your shots with a kit lens. It's not just aperture. Let's make it a little bit more visual. I think that's easier. So I took a few photos with my Canon M50 and the kit lens. So, two medium portraits, and what we see now is even more important for portrait photography, like this. If we compare them, you can see that not only the background in the 45mm 6.3 photo is a lot more pleasing, but also when we come this close, 15mm 3.5 will distort the face. It doesn't look natural anymore, and it's almost not usable for portraits. And that's really important because a lot of beginners think I have to choose between 3.5 and 6.3. I'll shoot at 3.5, zoomed out. You see, when you're looking for that blurry background, don't think that just shooting at the lowest aperture number is the best idea. Bottom line is, if you want that blurry background, which you can with a kit lens, you have to pay attention to aperture, but even more to focal length and distance to the subject. The closer you go, the more blurry the background will become. And then focal length is important to avoid distortions. When you shoot objects, maybe it's not that important, but definitely for people, always zoom in. And it doesn't matter if your aperture number is going up, because chances are the results will be more pleasing anyway, more blurry. Okay, so that was for photography. Now video. A lot of what I've said is pretty much the same, but we have another problem, and that's shake. Because I think you get the best results when zoomed in at f5.6 or 6.3. But the problem is then that when you zoom in all the way, it's a lot more difficult to keep a steady shot. In photography, you can, for example, just bump up the ISO so that you get a high shutter speed and sharp photos. But in video, you can't do something like that. When zoomed in, shake will be a lot more noticeable. Now, that doesn't mean you can't fix that. I've shot some cool B-roll with my kit lens all the way zoomed in. The trick is just to shoot in slow motion. 120 frames per second is perfect, but actually the B-roll that I did was shot in 60 frames per second, and it looks fairly smooth, right? Also, when you shoot this type of product B-roll, for example, and you zoom out all the way and go really close to the subject, it gets distorted in a way that it doesn't look natural anymore. Not realistic. There you go, guys. The kit lens. It's usually not a bad lens, just misunderstood. You just have to understand the limitations and what happens with different settings and different distances. And the most important thing you should remember is that shooting at the lowest aperture number won't always give you the best results or the most blurry background. Always take into account focal length and distance to the subject. Really important, especially when shooting with a kit lens. Thank you so much for watching and see you in the next one.